Okay, so I want you to picture a scene. It's a scene of just sheer theatrical horror. It's the end of the 9th century. We're somewhere in Northumbria in England, and there's this deep, rock-hewn pit just teeming with venomous snakes.
Right.
Into this pit, a man is thrown. He's wounded, he's captured, and he's just awaiting this slow, agonizing death. But as the snakes start to bite, as the venom sinks in, he's not screaming.
No.
He's laughing. And in his last moments, he delivers this declaration that's more than defiance. It's a prophecy. It's a guarantee. He says, how the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers.
And that single moment, that image, I mean, laughing in the face of that kind of pain, it just defines the entire essence of the Viking Age. It's a chilling promise, you know, delivered from the very mouth of death. It ensures his memory won't just survive. It's going to actively inspire this catastrophic retribution.
And that man is, of course, Ragnar Lothbrok, the ultimate Viking legend. But here's the central challenge and really the core mission of this deep dive.
Yeah, this is the big problem.
The man who supposedly spoke those words, Ragnar Lothbrok, the singular warrior, the dragon slayer, husband to shield maidens, historians aren't even sure he existed.
Not as one person, no. He's in this fascinating gray zone where history and mythology are just. They're completely tangled together.
So what's the issue? Is it the sources?
It's absolutely the sources. The problem structurally is that for centuries, the Vikings were primarily an oral culture. Their achievements, their family histories, all their sagas, they were passed down by mouth over bonfires across generations.
Right.
So when we finally see Ragnar's tale written on parchment, it's in the Icelandic sagas and the Danish chronicles of the 12th and 13th centuries.
Which is how long after he supposedly lived?
4 centuries, 400 years after his greatest raids in the 800s.
400 years. I mean, that's a massive historical gap. That's a game of telephone stretching across half a millennium. It's just ripe for exaggeration, for combining stories, for literary invention.
It is, and yet this is the paradox we have to confront. Whether Ragnar was one man or a composite of many leaders or even just a myth, his story absolutely defined history.
Because the revenge he promised actually happened.
Precisely. The figures who sought his vengeance, his sons, they're absolutely verifiable. They're documented historical leaders. The Great Heathen Army that launched a full-scale conquest of Anglo-Saxon England in 865.
That's a historical fact.
A documented historical fact. And they did it all under the explicit banner of avenging their father, the old boar.
So whether or not the myth is true, the consequence of the myth is absolutely real. So our goal today is to meticulously pick through all these sources. We're going to travel from the harsh Scandinavian fjords all the way to the heart of the Carolingian Empire. We'll cover shield maidens, prophetic queens, and the brutal historical transformation of England. All to understand why Ragnar Lothbrok remains the quintessential immortal Viking icon.
Let's do it.
So to really get Ragnar, we have to first immerse ourselves in the world that forged him. Let's set the stage. 8th century Scandinavia. What are we looking at?
We're looking at a landscape that is just defined by hardship. I mean, think endless, dense forests, coasts that are jagged and unwelcoming, and these brutal, brutal winters that would just crush anyone who was unprepared.
So life is a constant struggle.
It's a constant, grueling negotiation with the environment. Agriculture is a fight against rocky, thin soil and these frustratingly short growing seasons. But, and this is the key, that very hardship was the engine of their innovation. It's what pushed them to expand outward.
And the greatest representation of that ingenuity, the tool that let them project their power across the known world, was the Braker, the Viking longship. I've heard them called the stealth fighters of the medieval world, and that seems pretty accurate.
It's very accurate. Technologically, they were just revolutionary. Their single most important feature was their shallow draft.
What does that mean in practical terms?
It means they often required less than a meter, sometimes as little as 3 feet of water to float, so they could glide right over sandbars, and critically, they could navigate deep upriver systems far into the interior of Europe.
Places where conventional warships just couldn't go.
Absolutely couldn't follow. So you can picture yourself in a fortress, maybe 50 miles inland, thinking your position on the riverbank is secure.
Right. You feel totally safe.
And then suddenly you see a line of 100 dragon heads appearing around the bend. It would be instant, paralyzing terror.
And that image, that terror, that was part of the plan, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. The dragon heads, the Drekar on the prows, were absolutely intentional psychological warfare. They were designed to strike fear, to signify the arrival of of pagan chaos. It's interesting, though, some sources say they would take them down when approaching friendly coasts to avoid offending the local protective spirits.
That's a fascinating detail. So beyond the tech and the tactics, let's get into the why. Why did this culture so suddenly and so violently just burst out of Scandinavia around 793 AD?
There are several intertwined factors. One is ecological. There's some evidence that a shift in climate patterns, maybe a mini ice age starting, made farming even less reliable than it already was.
And you've got more mouths to feed.
Exactly. You have a growing population pressure. The land simply couldn't sustain the number of people living on it.
And the societal structure itself kind of pushed the problem outward.
Crucially, yes. The laws of inheritance, particularly a tradition called odal, often decreed that the land and the wealth passed primarily to the eldest son.
Leaving younger sons with...
What? Nothing. Pretty much nothing. It left younger sons, cousins, any ambitious man with very little means to gain status or establish their own household. They were effectively landless and wealthless.
So if you can't inherit land, wealth, and status, you've got to find it somewhere else.
You go find it across the sea. You go find it by targeting the wealthy, soft underbelly of Christian Europe.
And fueling all of this, kind of like gasoline on the fire, was their belief system, the promise of Valhalla.
That is the ultimate incentive. Dying honorably in combat was, for them, the ultimate goal. It secured your entry into Odin's Golden Hall, Valhalla.
Where you'd get to do what exactly?
You'd join the Einherjar, the honored dead. You'd spend your days feasting, drinking mead, and fighting glorious battles, all in preparation for Ragnarok, the final apocalyptic battle at the end of the world.
And compare that to the alternative.
The alternative was dying shamefully, of old age, of illness, dying in your bed. That meant you descended to hell, which was, well, it was an undesirable, second-tier, cold and dark afterlife.
So it's a stark contrast.
It's a huge contrast, and it created a cultural incentive for maximum risk-taking. It bred warriors who actively sought out combat, and in a very real sense, they embraced death. They saw it as the fastest, most glorious ticket to paradise.
So we have this perfect storm for someone like Ragnar to rise. You've got the technological superiority, the economic desperation, political instability in their targets.
Yeah. And a religious conviction that turned lethal warfare into a kind of spiritual advancement. This is the violent, innovative world that the sagas claim Ragnar arose from. And while they say he was the son of the Swedish king Sigurdring, the legend really emphasizes that his status was earned, not just inherited.
He had to prove he was worth it.
He had to prove it. And that starts with his very famous nickname.
Let's decode the name itself. Ragnar is pretty straightforward. It's Old Norse for warrior or army judgment. A good, strong name for a king.
Sure.
But Lothbrok, this is a name that history just can't forget. And it literally translates to hairy breeches, or maybe more crudely, shaggy pants.
It sounds a little absurd, doesn't it, for the most feared Viking king?
It really does.
Yes.
But the story behind it is everything.
It is. The tale behind Lothbrok is crucial because it immediately establishes Ragnar not as some mindless brute, but as a warrior who's defined by his intelligence and his meticulous preparation. And it all begins with a jarl named Harald and his daughter Thora.
The classic mythological setup. A princess in peril.
Precisely. So Thora was given a small pet serpent, which, as these things do in myths, grew exponentially.
Of course.
It eventually became this monstrous, dragon-like creature that encircled her entire dwelling. And this beast had lethal poisonous breath, and critically, its hide was said to be impervious to any normal weapon.
And the prize for slaying it.
The prize was Thora's hand in marriage, a contest for champions. But Ragnar, unlike the others, he knew that just brute force wasn't going to be enough.
He understood the threat. He had to think tactically.
He did. The venom was the primary defense of this creature. So he crafted these specialized breeches from a rough, shaggy animal hide. He then painstakingly boiled these breeches in pitch, this thick tar-like substance, and then immediately rolled them in coarse sand.
He's creating a kind of primitive biohazard suit.
That's a perfect way to put it, a medieval form of biological warfare defense. The pitch in the sand created this thick, rough, water-resistant barrier, almost like a crude canvas armor, specifically designed to resist the serpent's poisonous saliva and fangs.
So he prepares, he puts on his shaggy pants.
And he also supposedly soaked his entire body in water for extra protection. Then he went in and drove his spear right through the monster's heart.
And that victory, earned by cunning and prep, that's what gives him the name Lothbrok. But now, here's the reality check we have to do. How does this legendary serpent-slaying Ragnar square with the actual, fragile historical sources.
Yeah, we have to contrast the late sagas with the contemporary-ish Frankish documents. The royal chronicles of the Carolingian Empire, which are known as the Frankish Annals, they record a massive raid on Paris in 845 AD.
Okay.
And they name the leader of this huge 120-ship fleet as a chieftain called Ragnar.
Ragnar. That sounds close enough to Ragnar. Is that our guy?
It's a very strong possibility. Historians generally accept Ragnar as the historical kernel for the legendary Ragnar. He was clearly a very powerful leader who could conduct these huge, large-scale operations.
But there's a problem with the timeline, isn't there?
There is. The problem is that Ragnar basically disappears from the annals shortly after the Paris raid. He might have died in a plague that struck his fleet on the way home. He certainly doesn't show up leading armies 40 years later.
Which is where the saga timeline just completely breaks down. The legendary Ragnar has this long, multi-generational career that just, it doesn't fit the lifespan of the historical Ragnar.
And that gap is the foundation for what's called the composite figure theory. It's really the academic consensus.
Who says what?
It holds that Ragnar Lothbrok is an accumulation, an anthology of the heroic deeds of several different Viking leaders. You have Ragnar, possibly some of his more famous sons, and other powerful jarls known for these daring feats. Over the centuries, all these distinct historical figures just sort of coalesced into the single, perfect, mythological King Ragnar.
So he's not a historical lie. He's more of a cultural exaggeration, a collection of the greatest hits, the ultimate Viking compilation album.
That is a very good way to put it. And you could argue that the legendary figure became more important than any single historical one because he embodied everything the Vikings admired most: intelligence, defiance, naval mastery, and of course the ability to attract legendary partners.
Speaking of legendary partners, we absolutely have to talk about Lagertha, the first of Ragnar's famous wives, and, she's the quintessential shield maiden.
She is, and their relationship, according to the sources, begins in violence and vengeance.
Right. How do they meet?
Their meeting is recounted by Saxo Grammaticus, and it's just charged with this righteous fury. Ragnar was seeking vengeance for his grandfather, who had been killed by a figure named King Fro. And in a classic act of medieval humiliation, Fro had placed Ragnar's female relatives into a brothel.
An act of cruelty that spurred defiance.
It did. Some of these women escaped that humiliation and they armed themselves. They fought alongside the men, disguised in warrior's garb, and Lagertha was among them. Saxo described her, almost breathlessly, as a virgin warrior who possessed a spirit unequal to her delicate frame.
A warrior of such ferocity that she just commanded immediate attention.
Absolutely. Saxo's description is so vivid. He says she flew around the battlefield like a she-wolf, striking from every angle, and Ragnar was just immediately drawn to this combination of beauty and lethal skill. For a Viking king, a partner who could command and fight, that was the ultimate prize.
But Ragnar wasn't just handed this warrior queen. She tested him, didn't she?
Oh, she definitely tested him. The courtship challenge is the stuff of myth. Lagertha set a massive bear and a large ferocious dog to guard her dwelling.
So to get to her, he had to get past them.
He had to overcome these obstacles to prove his worth, and he did. He killed the bear with his spear, and legend says he choked the dog with his bare hands. It was a clear demonstration that his strength and his resolve matched her own very high standards.
So they married, they had children, a son named Friedleif. But the marriage, by all accounts, was pretty volatile and brief. Her ambition, though, it didn't end when Ragnar left.
Not at all. Lagertha was not a character who was defined by her husband. After they separated, she married a Norwegian chieftain, but then she quickly assassinated him.
Wow.
And the sagas explicitly state she thought it better to rule without a husband, and she seized control of Norway for herself. This establishes her as a political and military ruler in her own right. That's a rarity in the written records, but clearly it was an admired archetype.
And their relationship, even after the separation, it remained an active military alliance.
Yes, which speaks volumes about the mutual respect between them. When Ragnar was facing a critical losing battle, Lagertha arrived with a reinforcement fleet of 120 ships and sailed right into the fray. She executed this brilliant flanking maneuver, circled the enemy, and struck them from the rear, and completely turned the tide of battle. She ensured Ragnar's victory.
Now, for centuries, the whole idea of the shield maiden was basically dismissed as pure literary invention.
Yeah.
A fantasy created by poets like Saxo to make the sagas more exciting.
Right. It was seen as just a trope.
But modern archaeology has completely changed that debate.
It truly has. The turning point was the 2017 DNA analysis of a warrior grave in Birka, Sweden. This was a really high-status grave known as BJ 581, discovered way back in the late 19th century. It contained a full arsenal of weapon sword, axe, arrows, and, critically, a set of tactical gaming pieces.
Which indicates what? A strategist.
A high-ranking military strategist, exactly. And for over 100 years, everyone just assumed this magnificent warrior had to be a man.
Of course.
The assumption was just ingrained. But the osteological analysis and then the subsequent DNA analysis revealed unequivocally that the person buried in that magnificent warrior's tomb was biologically female.
It's a watershed moment.
It was a huge moment. Now, it doesn't prove that Lagertha herself existed, of course, but it definitively proves that women did achieve the highest military and social status in Viking society.
It validates the archetype. It gives Lagertha's story a firm basis and historical possibility. It shifts the whole conversation from pure fantasy to cultural reality.
Exactly. It validates the cultural memory that recognized and honored women not just as wives or mothers, but as independent, lethal forces on the battlefield and in governance.
So if Lagertha embodied that warrior's defiance, Ragnar's second legendary wife, Aslaug, she embodies something else entirely. She's the mystic, the philosophical one.
And her ancestry is just pure mythic dynamite.
I mean, we're talking about a next-level lineage here.
Absolutely. Aslaug was the daughter of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and Brynhild the Valkyrie, so she's literally descended from a figure who killed the ultimate monster and a divine chooser of the slain. After her parents' tragic deaths, she was raised in hiding by common peasants. Disguised in rags, they called her Kraka, to protect her identity.
And just like with Lagertha, her introduction to Ragnar involved a test. But this one wasn't about strength, it was about pure wit.
Pure intelligence, yes. Ragnar, having heard stories of her extraordinary beauty, challenged her with a very famous riddle. He demanded she appear before him, neither dressed nor undressed, neither hungry nor full, and neither alone nor accompanied.
Failure meant death.
Or at least severe punishment, yes. It was the ultimate philosophical puzzle.
So what was her solution?
It was ingenious. To be neither dressed nor undressed, she arrived wrapped only in a fishing net.
Okay.
To be neither hungry nor full, she had bitten into an onion but not actually swallowed it. And to be neither alone nor accompanied, she brought her small dog.
Wow. That's brilliant.
It's incredibly clever, and it confirmed her as a partner of deep intellect and resourcefulness.
And beyond her wit, Aslaug brought this incredible spiritual authority to the court as a vulva. How important was that role in Viking society?
Critically important. The vulva was so much more than a simple fortune teller. She was a seeress, a prophetess, a keeper of ancient knowledge that commanded immense respect and, frankly, fear. Kings and jarls would consult vulvas on major decisions, war, migration, the political future of their dynasties.
And Aslaug, with her divine lineage.
She possessed a spiritual authority that even a great king like Ragnar had to acknowledge.
And she used that authority to issue some of the most famous prophecies in the entire saga. Prophecies that Ragnar chose to ignore at his own peril.
Her most famous warning was about their first son. She implored Ragnar not to consummate their marriage for 3 nights, predicting that if he acted impulsively, their son would be born boneless.
And Ragnar swept up in his success.
He ignored the spiritual warning,
leading to Ivar the Boneless. And that name, Boneless, it's still one of the greatest mysteries in Viking history.
It truly is. We have 2 leading theories. The first is a medical theory, that he suffered from a condition like osteogenesis imperfecta, a genetic disorder that causes extremely fragile bones. If that were true, he would have been disabled, maybe even needing to be carried on a shield.
But that completely contradicts the sagas, which describe him as this fearsome, almost giant warrior.
It does. Which leads to the second theory, the metaphorical or political interpretation. Boneless might have been a kenning, a kind of poetic compound word referring to exceptional flexibility or stealth or just cunning. It could mean he was hard to pin down or that he was primarily a strategist, not a frontline brawler.
The brain, not the muscle.
The brain, exactly. But regardless of the truth, the prophecy cements Aslaug's spiritual power and the sense that even the great King Ragnar can't defy word or fate.
And she made other prophecies too, right?
She did. She also predicted the physical mark of another son, Sigurd. She claimed he'd be born with a distinct mark that looked like a serpent encircling his pupil, which is how he earned the name Sigurd Snake in the Eye. This constant stream of prophecy just kept the tension high and reinforced that this was no ordinary family. They were destined for extraordinary and often terrible things.
It sounds like a complex relationship. A partnership built on a mutual respect for power, not necessarily love.
It was very complex. At one point, Ragnar, perhaps frustrated, criticized her for not producing brave enough sons. And Aslaug immediately shot back that Ivar alone would prove to be more valuable than all his other sons combined. She knew the power that she had brought into the world, and she was fiercely protective of her legacy and her judgment.
Let's talk about that legacy then, the sons. The historical record acknowledges this dynasty, Ivar, Bjorn, Svitserk, Sigurd, as the central driving force of the Viking Age's most defining historical event. They were a thunder machine of conquest.
And Ivar the Boneless is the first and most terrifying. He represents that razor-sharp intellectual edge of Viking brutality. Regardless of the truth of his boneless status, all the sources agree he was the master strategist, he was the dux, the leader, while his brothers were the operational commanders.
So what were his key historical achievements?
Ivar is credited with founding the Viking Kingdom of Dublin, which established this vast and enduring Viking presence in Ireland. But his greatest impact was his leadership of the Great Heathen Army in England. He conquered East Anglia, he led the eventual capture of York. He was systematic, cunning, and just absolutely ruthless.
And this ruthlessness is forever associated with the most horrific ritual in Viking history, the Blood Eagle.
We have to discuss the Blood Eagle with a lot of caution. According to the sagas, Ivar performed this ritual on King Ella of Northumbria, the man who killed his father. And the description is agonizing. The ribs are severed from the spine and pulled outward, forming a crude pair of wings, all while the victim is still alive.
But historians are incredibly divided on whether this ever actually took place. Why so much skepticism?
It comes down entirely to the source material. The ritual is only described in detail in the very late sagas, like the work of Saxo Grammaticus. It only appears a handful of times in all of Norse literature. We have zero archaeological evidence and no contemporary Anglo-Saxon or Frankish sources that otherwise delighted in describing Viking atrocities ever mentioned it.
So if it didn't happen, what's the explanation?
Well, many scholars now believe the Blood Eagle was a literary invention, or maybe a potent metaphor, or even a severe misinterpretation of skaldic poetry. It might have been a kenning that just described the death of someone who was left prone, their backs cut open by ravens or scavengers, thus feeding the eagles. The fact that it's specifically attributed to Ivar, though, that defines his enduring reputation as the master of terror and psychological warfare.
Okay, moving on to Bjorn Ironside. He took Viking exploration to a completely new level. He traveled far beyond the usual raiding routes.
Bjorn was the global explorer of the dynasty. He, often with his half-brother Hastein, led fleets into the far south. They navigated the Straits of Gibraltar, they conducted raids along the coasts of Spain and Morocco, they attacked southern France, and eventually sailed all the way to Italy. This was an unprecedented, multi-year, 2,000-mile venture.
And his fame really hinges on his extraordinary cunning, which is epitomized by the Luna trick in Italy.
The Luna trick perfectly showcases the Viking emphasis on intelligence over, say, battlefield honor. So Bjorn and his men mistook the city of Luna for Rome. An understandable error, given its splendor, but the walls were just impregnable.
So they couldn't fight their way in.
No. So Bjorn devised this audacious deception. He sent messengers to the bishop claiming that he, Bjorn, was mortally ill and, realizing the error of his pagan ways, wished to convert to Christianity and receive a full Christian burial inside the city walls.
A brilliant piece of theater designed to exploit Christian piety.
And it worked flawlessly. The Christian citizens, believing they were saving the soul of a dying king, they welcomed the coffin into the city. At the funeral, Bjorn burst from the coffin. His men, who had infiltrated as mourners, secured the gates, and they sacked the city from within.
That's incredible.
It defines Bjorn. Ruthless opportunism coupled with a spectacular capacity for deceit.
And what about the other famous sons, Svitserk and Sigurd, Snake in the Eye?
Svitserk, which means white shirt, was also a major commander in the Great Heathen Army. He's often historically equated with a figure named Halfdan Ragnarsson, who became the King of York, a figure of massive historical significance who helped solidify Viking rule in England.
And Sigurd is the link to modern royalty.
Absolutely. Sigurd, Snake in the Eye, became King of Denmark. And crucially, his bloodline is historically traceable through the Munso dynasty, and it links directly to later Swedish and Danish royal houses. This proves that Ragnar's family didn't just raid Europe. They established enduring royal dynasties that shaped Scandinavian politics for centuries.
So now we have to focus on the one event where the historical record is clearest, and maybe the most horrifying. The Siege of Paris in 845 AD. This is really the peak achievement of Ragnar, the probable historical Ragnar.
This is where we leave the colorful sagas behind and we rely on the contemporary Frankish annals. In the spring of 845, a fleet of 120 Viking longships carrying thousands of warriors sailed completely unmolested up the Seine River. This wasn't a quick raid. This was a strategic operation aimed at the very heart of the Carolingian Empire.
Why Paris, specifically? Why not easier, richer targets in the south?
Paris was the symbolic prize. It was the wealthy capital of West Francia, ruled by Charles the Bald, who was a grandson of Charlemagne himself. Targeting Paris delivered maximum psychological impact, vast wealth, and religious shock. It was the ultimate, audacious statement of Viking power.
And Charles the Bald was in a desperate position at the time, right?
Yeah.
The Carolingian Empire was fractured by civil wars. It was the perfect window of opportunity for Ragnar.
He was disastrously weak. When the Vikings arrived, Charles rashly divided his army to defend both banks of the Seine, and Ragnar, a master tactician, immediately pounced on the smaller, isolated force on one bank and just annihilated it.
And then came the deliberate act of psychological terror that shattered Frankish morale.
On March 28, 845, which was Easter Sunday, the holiest day of the Christian calendar, Ragnar captured 111 Frankish soldiers. He marched them out to an island in the Seine, and he publicly hanged them in full view of Charles the Bald and what was left of the Frankish forces.
The message was brutal, and it was clear. Your god cannot save you from the Norse gods.
It was pure ideological warfare. Faced with the complete collapse of his defenses and the demoralization of his troops, Charles the Bald had to concede defeat. He entered negotiations, and that led to the devastating payment of 7,000 pounds of silver.
That sum is just staggering for the time. What was the mechanism and, I guess, the consequence of that payment?
That payment became known as the Danegeld, or Danish gold. It was essentially protection money paid to the invaders to leave and spare the city. While it saved Paris temporarily, its long-term consequence was absolutely catastrophic for all of Western Europe.
Because it taught the Vikings a fatal lesson.
Exactly. The Danegeld established a dangerous precedent. The powerful Frankish kingdoms were rich, they were weak, and they were willing to pay enormous sums. It became an economic incentive structure for future Viking leaders. By paying, Charles the Bald inadvertently intensified and perpetuated the Viking Age for decades to come.
And what happened to Ragnar himself after achieving arguably the greatest military and financial victory of his life?
Well, interestingly, the Frankish annals provide a brief note on his return trip. A pestilence, probably a severe epidemic of some kind, struck the Viking fleet as they sailed home. Many men died, and Ragnar himself might have been severely weakened or maybe even died in the aftermath. And that setback could explain why the historical Ragnar fades from the records, and maybe that fueled the need for the sagas to invent a grander, more defiant end for their hero.
Which brings us right back to that legendary climax. After Paris, and perhaps driven by a need to outshine his increasingly famous sons, the legendary Ragnar makes one final, fatal decision. A personal, small-scale invasion of Northumbria in England, ruled by King Ella.
The sources suggest either immense hubris or maybe desperation. Ragnar, against the advice of his prophetess wife, sailed with an almost impossibly small force, some accounts say only 2 long ships, to conquer an entire kingdom. It was a failure of reconnaissance and resource management from the very start.
And the North Sea didn't cooperate.
No. A massive storm wrecked his ships on the Northumbrian coast. The surviving warriors, including Ragnar, were quickly captured by the forces of King Ella, who understood exactly the significance of his prisoner. This wasn't just any raider. This was the most famous chieftain of the age.
So Ella wanted to make a statement to ensure Ragnar's death would be as memorable as his life.
The execution had to be spectacular and agonizing, hence the snake pit. Ragnar was stripped of his heavy Viking armor and thrown into a pit of venomous serpents. This was the ultimate test of the Viking spirit. Courage in the face of slow, horrifying agony.
And instead of fear, Ragnar offered defiance. He laughed and he sang his death song.
He was celebrating his entry into Valhalla. The sagas record his Krakomal, or his death song, where he recounts all his victories and he welcomes death, declaring, "I will now proceed to the tables of Odin, ready to drink with the gods." This death for him was an act of worship.
And then the promise.
Yeah.
The final iconic lines.
How the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. It is a chilling, direct threat, guaranteeing that his sons would hear of his torture and they would return to extract a vengeance proportionate to his suffering. It sets the stage for the greatest historical invasion of England.
Okay, so once again, the historical fact check. How reliable is the snake pit death?
Almost certainly, it is literary embellishment. The specific details of the snake pit only appear in those much later 12th and 13th century sources. It provides a perfect, dramatic arc to the hero's life, a sacrificial death that ensures his immortality through vengeance. It just perfectly codified the Viking values of defiance, fate, and lasting legacy.
So if it's not historically true, why did that version survive over all the others?
Because it tells a deeper truth about the culture. It emphasizes that physical suffering is transient, but the legacy of courage is eternal. Ragnar's defiance in the pit wasn't just courage, it was a philosophical statement that his fate, his word, was guaranteed, and his sons would be the instruments of that fate.
And the moment those final words were supposedly uttered, the focus shifts entirely from saga to verifiable history. In 865 AD, less than 2 decades after Reginhari's Paris raid, the Great Heathen Army arrived in England. And this was not a raid, this was a national conquest.
This invasion is documented extensively in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which explicitly identifies the leaders as the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. The scale was just enormous. Modern estimates suggest somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 warriors, led by Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, who is Fitzurk, and Ubba.
And the mission was explicit. Vengeance for their father and the permanent conquest of the fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
They systematically targeted the kingdoms that composed England at the time. Their first target was East Anglia. They used it as a secure base of operations. And the vengeance was immediate and symbolic. They captured the local king, Edmund.
And the method of his execution was designed to terrify.
According to the sources, Edmund refused to renounce his Christian faith. So he was tied to a tree, he was scourged, he was shot with arrows until he resembled a hedgehog, and then he was finally beheaded. This was a statement of ideological superiority and brutal conquest. Edmund was later canonized as a martyr saint by the English, which really underscores the severity of the Viking threat.
And next, they moved on to Northumbria to deal with King Ella directly.
They ruthlessly exploited the existing civil war and political chaos in Northumbria. They captured the ancient Roman city of York in 866 AD. They installed a puppet ruler, and then they finally captured Ella himself. And the sagas insist that Ella was subjected to the Blood Eagle by Ivar, again serving as that perfect mythological closure to Ragnar's story.
The speed and success of this invasion nearly wiped Anglo-Saxon England right off the map.
They collapsed the political structure. Northumbria fell, East Anglia was conquered, Mercia was repeatedly attacked and subdued. The only kingdom that managed to survive the onslaught was Wessex, under its king, Alfred the Great.
And Alfred was pushed to the absolute breaking point.
He was a man fighting for the survival of his civilization. We have that famous, though probably apocryphal, anecdote of him hiding in the marshes of Somerset, disguised as a peasant, so demoralized by the state of his kingdom that he absent-mindedly burned a peasant woman's cakes. It just illustrates the sheer despair of the Anglo-Saxons facing an enemy that seemed unstoppable.
But the nature of the Viking presence, it eventually shifted, didn't it? It went from pure conquest to settlement.
It did. The leaders, particularly Ivar, began establishing permanent seats of power, like the Viking kingdom of Dublin. Other warriors realized that farming and trade offered more long-term stability than perpetual raiding. And by 878 AD, Alfred, having finally achieved a military victory, negotiated the Treaty of Wedmore.
Which legally carved up England.
It did. The treaty established the Danelaw, the area of Viking-controlled territory in the north and east of England. And this transition was profoundly transformative. The Vikings were now settlers, they were farmers, they were administrators governing their own regions. This was the true, lasting revenge of Ragnar Lothbrok.
And the cultural fusion that resulted permanently transformed the English language and identity.
The legacy is literally in the words we use every single day. The Norse language introduced words like they, their, them, sky, skull, and thousands of place names ending in suffixes like by as in Derby and Thorpe as in village. Ragnar's sons didn't just kill kings, they permanently changed the cultural DNA of England, ensuring their influence was embedded forever.
So, having meticulously analyzed the sagas against the annals, we have to return to our central and probably unanswerable question. Was Ragnar Lothbrok a real person?
The answer is still nuanced. I think we can be almost certain that a chieftain named Reginhari existed. He conducted the siege of Paris, and he was a historical figure around whom the legends clustered. But the Ragnar who slew the serpent married a Valkyrie's daughter and commanded the loyalty of 4 legendary sons over this massive, implausible lifespan that is definitively a composite figure.
The timeline just doesn't work for one human life, no matter how extraordinary.
It doesn't. killing a dragon in Sweden, marrying a powerful woman in Norway, raiding Paris, and then dying decades later in England while his adult sons are simultaneously conquering Scotland and Ireland. It's just too much for one 9th century man. He functions as an anthology, a repository of the greatest military, intellectual, and legendary achievements of the early Viking Age.
And that leads back to that kenning theory, the hairy breeches title. Was that just an epithet that was applied to multiple leaders?
That theory holds significant weight. Ragnar Lothbrok could have started as a highly respected or feared title, perhaps referring to warriors who wore distinctive protective gear, or those who survived incredible feats against poison or the elements. As these stories were passed down, they just naturally coalesced around the most famous name associated with the era.
So he's less of a king and more of a cultural ideal. He's the Viking King Arthur.
That is the most powerful analogy. Like Arthur, Ragnar has a kernel of historical truth, that legendary figure. But he quickly transcended that to become the perfect symbolic embodiment of his culture's values. He represents the ideal blend of exploration, calculated aggression, meritocracy, and defiance against fate.
And the dynasty didn't stop at the Danelaw. The influence of Ragnar's lineage, it stretches directly into the heart of modern European royalty.
Oh, absolutely. Through Sigurd's Snake in the Eye, the bloodline is verifiably connected to key Swedish and Danish royal houses. But maybe the most fascinating link is to the Normans. Later sources often connect Rollo, the Viking who became the first Duke of Normandy, as either a son or a close relative, maybe a nephew of Ragnar Lothbrok.
And Rollo's lineage leads straight to the most significant military event in British history.
It does. Rollo is the direct ancestor of William the Conqueror. So when William successfully invaded and conquered England in 1066, he was effectively completing what the Great Heathen Army had started 2 centuries earlier. If those genealogies connecting Rollo to Ragnar hold even a small kernel of truth, the conquest of England became a highly delayed, highly successful Lothbrok family enterprise.
Which means, through the intertwined royal houses of Europe, Ragnar Lothbrok is, culturally and maybe even genetically, everywhere.
His influence pervades the genealogies of Europe, the French crown, the British crown, even the Habsburgs. And while, medieval genealogies were often fabricated for prestige, the simple fact that European royalty wanted to claim descent from Ragnar, the ultimate Viking, that speaks to his enduring cultural currency.
And finally, his modern resurrection. For a new generation, the television series Vikings just cemented Ragnar's status as a global anti-hero icon.
That show, starting in 2013, created a massive cultural phenomenon. Travis Fimmel's portrayal captured a Ragnar who wasn't just a warrior, he was a philosopher, a complex figure who wrestled with his faith, his legacy, the nature of the gods.
Why do you think that portrayal and the larger Viking mythos resonate so deeply with modern audiences?
I think he embodies the ultimate disruptor. We're drawn to his rejection of pure aristocratic heritage. He was the self-made man who valued intellect and strategic thinking over blind loyalty, and he faced these existential questions of fate, of wired with defiance and humor, which makes him deeply appealing in a modern world that's searching for meaning and agency. His story is about challenging boundaries, meritocracy, and just embracing the unknown.
So we began this deep dive with a man laughing in a pit of snakes. What did Ragnar Lothbrok ultimately purchase with that final excruciating moment of courage?
He purchased immortality. For the historian, he remains this frustrating, dazzling puzzle. For the storyteller, he's a gift of unparalleled drama. But for Ragnar himself, his ultimate victory was ensuring that his legacy and his name would survive the ravages of time and history.
How the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers.
That promise, that curse, it was fulfilled by the Great Heathen Army. His vengeance transformed a continent, and the fame he prophesied has ensured that over 1,000 years later, the world is still captivated by his legend.
He achieved a form of eternity that's greater than any earthly kingdom.
Indeed. In Norse mythology, even the Golden Hall of Odin, Valhalla, is destined to fall and burn during Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. But stories, the shared cultural memory carried by poets and chroniclers and descendants, stories can last forever. The old boar's little pigs grew up, they grunted, they conquered, and they ensured that the name Ragnar Lothbrok will never be forgotten. And that's a powerful truth to take away.
Truly unforgettable. Until the next deep dive, then.